I had to wait 3 days for the floor to dry before I could even touch the baseboards. The house on Elm Avenue had been vacant since November, and when the bank finally approved my bid, the basement was holding about 4 inches of stagnant gray water that smelled like wet laundry and old battery acid. I spent the first week in a pair of heavy rubber boots dragging a rented submersible pump from corner to corner, watching the line on the concrete slowly recede until it left nothing but a greasy ring of silt. A house like that doesn't let you start with the cosmetic stuff. It forces you to look at the joints first. By Tuesday, the air was clear enough that I could take off the respirator. My contract with the property management firm gave me 45 days to get the first floor rentable, which meant the kitchen and the small utility room took priority over everything else. The previous tenant had left in a hurry. There were still half-empty jars of instant coffee in the cupboards and a pair of cheap plastic lawn chairs sitting right in the middle of what used to be the dining room. You get used to that in this business. People lose their jobs or their marriages fall apart and they just walk out the front door with whatever fits in the back of a sedan. The rest becomes my problem. And the first thing that didn't make sense was the pantry door. It was a standard hollow core door, painted a thick, glossy white that had started to yellow around the brass knob, but someone had installed a heavy sliding bolt lock on the outside of it. Not a small brass hook either. This was a 6-inch iron bar fastened into the pine frame with 3-inch wood screws. I didn't think much of it while I was clearing out the rotten shelving inside. People put locks on strange things when they have toddlers or big dogs they want to keep out of the trash. I used the back of my framing hammer to pry the screws loose, tossed the iron hardware into a 5-gallon bucket of scrap metal, and went back to scraping the linoleum off the kitchen floor. It was tedious work. The adhesive they used in the late 70s doesn't want to leave the subfloor, so you have to go inch by inch with a long-handled razor scraper, your shoulders aching before lunch. Around 3 in the afternoon, the blade caught on something hard near the base of the refrigerator alcove. I figured it was a dropped finishing nail or an old staple, so I leaned down with my utility knife to cut around it. It wasn't metal. It was a small, neat square of dark plastic, about the size of a postage stamp, tucked perfectly into the seam where the plywood met the drywall. When I pulled it out with a pair of needle nose pliers, a thin black wire followed it, no thicker than dental floss. I gave it a firm tug, expecting it to be dead phone wire or an old coaxial cable from a defunct satellite dish, but it didn't give. It ran straight down into the wall cavity toward the basement. I didn't have time to chase old wiring through the framing, so I snipped it flush with the floorboards, let the tail drop back into the dark, and kept scraping. The sun goes down fast behind the maples in that yard, and by 5 o'clock, the kitchen was too dark to see the grease lines on the floor. I locked the back door, checked the deadbolt on the front, and drove back to my apartment on the north side of town. The next morning was colder. The truck took 10 minutes to warm up, and when I got to Elm Avenue, the grass was white with frost. Inside, the house had that specific, hollow chill that only comes from an empty basement. I started on the plumbing under the kitchen sink, lying on my back with a flashlight between my teeth, trying to loosen a corroded brass nut that had practically welded itself to the copper supply line. While I was laying there, waiting for the penetrating oil to work its way into the threads, I noticed the smell again. It wasn't the wet laundry smell from Monday. It was sweeter, like old celery or damp cardboard that had been sitting in a warm trunk. I rolled over onto my side to look at the base of the cabinet, where the hot and cold lines came up through the floor. The hole the original plumber had drilled was slightly too large. About an inch of dead space surrounded the copper pipes. I reached for my flashlight and shined the beam down into the gap. The light hit the top of the main foundation beam in the basement, about 4 feet below me. Sitting right on top of that rough sawn timber, directly beneath the kitchen floorboards, was an empty green glass bottle of ginger ale. I took the flashlight out of my mouth and sat up, my knees cracking against the underside of the sink. That bottle hadn't been there when I pumped the water out on Monday. I knew that because I had spent 3 hours down there with a shop vac, clearing every piece of loose debris off the floor so the drain wouldn't clog again. The foundation beam was clean when I left. I remembered looking at the joists to check for dry rot. I got up, walked through the living room, and opened the basement door. The air coming up from the stairs was cold, but it carried that same sweet, flat scent of old cardboard. I went down slowly, my boots clicking on the damp concrete steps. When I reached the bottom, I walked straight to the main beam beneath the kitchen. The green bottle was exactly where I'd seen it through the floorboards. It was clean. No dust, no gray silt from the flood, and the label was still crisp and dry. Next to it lay a pair of small silver fingernail clippers and a half-eaten sleeve of saltine crackers in a crinkly plastic wrapper. The crackers weren't stale. The sleeve was still pliable, twisted shut at the open end with a red rubber band. I stood there in the gray light of the single bulb, looking at the beam. The timber was about 8 feet off the concrete floor, high enough that you'd need a stepladder or a very long reach to set something on top of it. I didn't own a stepladder yet. Mine was still in the back of the truck. I picked up the bottle. It was cold to the touch, the glass heavy and thick. There was about half an inch of clear liquid left in the bottom, with a few tiny bubbles still clinging to the green sides. I didn't open it. I set it back down on the wood, exactly where I found it, and went back upstairs to get my tool belt. A person tells themselves a lot of things when they're alone in an old house. You tell yourself the previous owner must have dropped those things months ago and they somehow stayed dry during the flood. You tell yourself the neighborhood kids found a way in through one of the small cellar windows, even though I'd spent Tuesday morning nailing plywood over every single opening that was larger than a toaster. You do that because the alternative doesn't fit into a normal Wednesday. The alternative means you aren't the only one with the key. I spent the rest of the day working on the first floor bathroom, replacing the wax ring under the toilet and clearing hair out of the shower drain. Every hour or so, I'd stop what I was doing and just listen. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic thump-thump of the old water heater in the utility room and the occasional crow calling from the maples outside. Twice, I thought I heard the floorboards click in the kitchen. That sharp, dry sound oak makes when weight shifts across it. But when I walked out there, the room was empty and the tools were exactly where I'd left them on the counter. Before I left at 6, I did something I hadn't done since I started the job. I walked through every room on the first floor and checked the window latches. They were all down, their brass small and secure against the frames. I went down to the basement, took the green bottle, the clippers, and the crackers off the beam and carried them out to the truck. I threw them into the bed, under the toolbox where they wouldn't rattle around. Then I locked the back door, shook the handle until my forearm hurt, and drove home. Thursday morning was different because of the truck. When I turned the key, the engine cranked over twice and then died with a dry, hollow click. The battery was completely flat. I had to wait 40 minutes for a neighbor to give me a jump, and by the time I parked on Elm Avenue, it was nearly 9 o'clock. The front yard looked exactly the same, but when I walked up the porch steps, I noticed a small streak of dark grease on the brass deadbolt. It looked like someone had tried to oil the mechanism with heavy machine grease, the kind you use on tractor axles. I wiped it off with my thumb, inserted my key, and turned it. The cylinder didn't move. It wasn't stuck from the cold. It felt like the pins inside had been stripped or jammed with something solid. I had to use the back door. The small gravel path leading around the side of the house was soft from the morning thaw, and my boots sank an inch into the mud with every step. When I reached the kitchen door, I didn't look at the lock first. I looked at the mat. It was a cheap Coyer welcome mat I'd bought at the hardware store on Monday to keep from tracking wet silt into the house. It had been shifted about 6 inches to the left, revealing the clean, unweathered concrete underneath. The door itself opened without a sound. The latch was completely clean. No grease on this one, but when I stepped into the kitchen, the air was warm. The thermostat in the hallway was an old mercury dial that I'd set to 55 degrees on Monday to keep the pipes from freezing while I worked. I walked over to it now. The little red pointer had been pushed all the way to 72. I didn't turn it down. I stood in the narrow hallway looking at the dial, my hands deep in my coat pockets. The house was perfectly silent, but the warmth made it feel small, like a sweater that had been worn by someone else right before you put it on. I went back to the kitchen and sat down on one of the plastic lawn chairs the previous tenant had left behind. My tool belt was sitting on the counter where I'd left it Wednesday night, but the yellow handle of my drywall saw was sticking out of the top pouch instead of the side loop where I always keep it. It's a habit you develop after 10 years of doing trim work. Your hand goes to the same spot every time without looking. If a tool is 3 inches to the left, you notice it before you even pick it up. I pulled the saw out of the pouch. The teeth were clean, but the orange plastic guard that covers the blade was missing. I looked down at the floor around the counter, thinking it must have slipped off when I set the belt down, but the linoleum was bare. That was when I looked at the pantry door again. The 3 holes where the iron sliding bolt had been screwed into the frame were clean, but someone had taken a pencil, a soft, dark carpenter's pencil, and drawn a small, heavy line between them, connecting the dots until they formed a narrow triangle pointing directly at the door handle. It wasn't a casual mark. The lead had been pressed so hard into the white paint that the wood underneath had splintered slightly, leaving a tiny pile of yellow dust on the molding below. I didn't do any work that morning. I sat in the chair with my coat on, watching the kitchen window. The sky stayed gray, a thick, low ceiling of clouds that didn't move all forenoon. Around noon, I decided to go down to the basement to check the main water valve. The pressure in the bathroom had been low the day before, and I wanted to make sure the main line wasn't leaking behind the foundation wall where the pump had been running. The stairs were darker than usual because the single bulb at the bottom had burned out. I had to use the flashlight on my phone, the small blue beam cutting through the damp air as I went down step by step. When I reached the concrete floor, I turned the light toward the foundation beam where I'd found the ginger ale bottle the day before. The beam was empty, but directly beneath it, sitting in the center of the concrete floor where the water had been deepest on Monday, was a small green plastic lawn chair. It was identical to the two chairs sitting in my dining room upstairs. I walked over to it, the light from my phone shaking slightly against the green plastic. The seat was dry. On the small rectangular tray molded into the right armrest sat the orange plastic guard from my drywall saw. Next to it was a small piece of lined notebook paper, folded twice into a neat square. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct I had from 30 years of living in normal towns told me to drop the phone, walk up the stairs, get into my truck, and never look at Elm Avenue again. But you don't do that when you have $10,000 of your own money tied up in a bank lien. You open the paper because you need to know if you're dealing with a squatter or a lunatic. I unfolded the square. The handwriting was neat, small, and written with a blue ballpoint pen that had started to run out of ink near the bottom, leaving faint white tracks through the middle of the letters. The floorboards in the dining room are single-tongue oak from 1924. They don't have a subfloor beneath them, just a joist and 2 inches of dead space above the lath. When you walk from the sink to the refrigerator, your left heel hits the knot in the third board from the wall. It makes a double click. The second click is louder than the first. I can hear it through the wool when I'm sitting under the stairs. I didn't breathe for 5 seconds. My eyes stayed on the word wool. I turned the light of my phone away from the chair and aimed it toward the far corner of the basement, past the old furnace where the space under the stairs was enclosed by rough cedar boards. There was no door on that enclosure, just a narrow 3-foot opening where they used to shovel coal into the old bin before the house was converted to gas in the 60s. The light hit the opening. The coal bin was dark, the cedar black from decades of coal dust, but someone had hung a heavy, gray army blanket across the gap, fastening it to the top joist with 4 large roofing nails. The blanket was thick, the wool rough and matted, and the bottom edge cleared the concrete floor by about 2 inches. In that 2-inch gap between the gray wool and the damp concrete, I could see the tips of 2 clean, brown leather work boots. They weren't moving. They were pointed straight toward me about 15 feet away. The house was completely still. The water heater didn't thump. The crows outside were gone. The only sound was the faint, high-pitched hum of the transformer in my phone as the screen stayed bright. I didn't scream. I didn't drop the light. I turned around and walked toward the stairs. I didn't run because running means you're acknowledging what's behind the blanket, and if you acknowledge it, the rules change. I went up the steps one by one, my right hand gripping the cold pine railing until the splinters bit into my palm. My boots made that heavy, rhythmic clack-clack on the wood, and every time my left heel hit a step, I thought about the double click in the kitchen. Yep, dude. When I reached the top of the stairs, I didn't look back. I stepped into the hallway, reached for the heavy oak door that separated the basement from the kitchen, and pulled it shut. The latch didn't catch. The strike plate on the doorframe had been filled with something hard and gray. The same axle grease I'd seen on the front deadbolt that morning. It had been packed into the small rectangular hole until it was flush with the metal, preventing the bolt from sliding in. I didn't try to clear it out. I just held the knob with both hands, pulling it hard against the frame, my boots bracing against the linoleum. I stood there for 3 minutes, my chest heaving, listening to the wood on the other side of the panel. Nothing came up the stairs. There was no sound of boots on the concrete, no rustle of wool against cedar. There was only the low, steady hiss of the gas furnace kicking on in the utility room, sending a wave of warm, sweet air through the register at my feet. I let go of the knob. I walked out the back door, leaving my tool belt, my saw, and my wallet on the kitchen counter. I didn't look at the mud path as I ran around the side of the house. I got into the truck, turned the key, the engine started instantly this time, and backed out of the driveway so fast the rear tires caught on the curb, throwing a shower of cold gravel across the frozen lawn. I didn't go to the police station. I drove straight to the property management office on Main Street. The girl behind the desk, a 20-something named Clara, who always wore her hair in a tight bun, looked up from her computer when I banged the glass door open. "I need the keys changed on Elm Avenue," I said, my voice sounding flat and dry in the small, warm office. "Right now. Someone's in the house." Clara blinked at me, her fingers resting on the keyboard. "Mr. Vance, we only gave you one set. The bank doesn't have a duplicate. We had to drill the locks on Monday just to let you in." "There's someone living in the coal bin," I said, leaning over the counter until she shifted her chair back an inch. "They've got a blanket up. They've got a chair down there. They know where the floorboards squeak." She looked at me for a long moment, then reached for a manila folder on the corner of her desk. It was the property file for 412 Elm Avenue. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning down the first page until she found the tenant history. "The previous occupant was a Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dropping into that professional, neutral tone they use when they're dealing with difficult contractors. "He was evicted in November for non-payment. The bailiff came out on the 14th, changed the cylinders on the front and back doors, and cleared the personal property out. There shouldn't be anyone there." "He didn't leave," I said. Clara looked back down at the folder. She didn't say anything for 10 seconds. Then her finger stopped near the bottom of the sheet where the bailiff's signature was stamped in red ink. "Mr. Vance," she said, looking up at me with a slight frown. "When the bailiff completed the lockout in November, he noted in the report that the basement was already flooded. He couldn't get down there to check the utility meters because the water was up to the 5th step. He just locked the upper doors from the outside and left." I stood there, the heat from the office radiator hitting the back of my neck. The water had been 4 inches deep when I arrived on Monday, but it had been there since November. 4 months of standing water in a dark basement. A person can't live in 4 inches of gray silt for 4 months. Their boots would be rotted through. The crackers would be mush. The gray army blanket would be green with mold from the waterline down. But the boots I'd seen through the light of my phone were clean. They were dry, light brown leather with yellow laces tied in a neat double knot. I walked out of the office without saying goodbye. I drove to the hardware store, bought 2 heavy brass padlocks and a 4-foot length of hardened steel chain, and drove back to Elm Avenue. The sun was already starting to drop behind the maples, casting long blue shadows across the frosted grass. I didn't go inside. I stood on the back porch with the chain in my hand, looking through the small glass pane of the kitchen door. My tool belt was still on the counter. The drywall saw was still sticking out of the top pouch, but the pencil mark on the pantry door was gone. Someone had wiped it away with a damp cloth, leaving nothing but 3 small gray smudges where the white paint had been scrubbed clean down to the primer. I passed the chain through the large, D-shaped handle of the back door, wrapped it twice around the heavy iron porch railing, and snapped the brass padlock shut. Then, I went to the front porch and did the same to the main door handles, pulling the steel links until they were taut against the oak. I haven't been back to the house since Thursday. The property management firm sent me a certified letter yesterday morning, reminding me of my 45-day limit and threatening to withhold my deposit if the kitchen isn't completed by the 15th. They think I'm just another contractor who took on too many jobs at once and ran out of time. I'm sitting in my apartment now, looking at the 5-gallon bucket of scrap metal I brought home on Tuesday. The 6-inch iron sliding bolt is sitting right at the top, resting against a pile of rusty hinges and old drywall screws. I took it out of the bucket an hour ago to look at the 3 wood screws that were still stuck in the iron frame. The threads are clean, but the tips aren't gray or rusted like the rest of the metal. They have tiny, bright curls of white pine wood still caught in the grooves. The kind of clean yellow shavings you only get when a screw has been turned into a fresh piece of timber within the last 48 hours. If you bought an old house that had been locked from the outside for 4 months, would you check the locks on the inside of the pantry before you went to sleep?